Want a cookie? Oh, I know you just ate, so you're craving something a little sweet. Besides, one cookie isn't gonna kill you. How about half? Just a bite? Bite it. Bite it. Bite it.
Food noise isn't fair, but Mochi Health is. Your affordable GLP-1 source that puts you on a path to successful weight loss by quieting food noise.
Bite it!
Shh. Learn more at joinmochi.com. Mochi members have access to licensed physicians and nutritionists. Results may vary.
In the autumn of 1786, Jane Austen returned from school to a rectory that was noticeably quiet. James and George had both been gone for several years. James to Oxford to begin his studies, and George to be cared for by a distant relative. Edward had just departed England on his grand tour of Europe, and Frank, at age 12, had just left to join the Royal Naval Academy. Only Henry and Charles remained at the rectory. Soon afterwards, Christmas would arrive and fill the home with people again, including Aunt Philadelphia, Cousin Eliza, and Eliza's new baby Hastings. Although the frost was so thick it crept into bedchambers that winter, the Austens and Eliza kept busy and warm by putting on a family play in the barn. At age 11, this may have been Jane's first time in the spotlight of the stage. But soon, Christmas would end, her brothers would depart, as would Aunt Philadelphia and Cousin Eliza. Steventon would grow quiet again. So, what does a young Jane Austen do without the excitement of school or the influence of older relatives? She writes. Jane's teenage writings reveal the stirrings of an early genius beginning to develop, and within them, we find yet another intriguing mystery. Was an adolescent Jane about to pen her first published essay under an assumed name? And if so, what does that tell us about the author who would one day become the Jane Austen? This is Finding Jane Austen, Episode 4, The Prodigy. I'm your host, Dr. Ann Ferdig. How do we find Jane Austen? That is the question at the heart of this series. And so far, we have followed the everyday comings and goings of her earliest years. But Jane's biography is missing several chapters. Between 1786, when Jane left Reading Abbey School, and 1796, which is the date of her earliest surviving letter, what we know of Jane largely comes not from her facts, but from her fictions. The fictions in question are what we call her teenaged writings. They include short stories, novels, plays, and poems. They are a reflection, not just of Jane's ability to create, but also of her great capacity for understanding and challenging the world around her, even at a young age. In these next two episodes, we're taking a deep dive into the 18th century pop culture that young Jane loved, from books to theater to music. And in studying the ways in which these influential works shaped young Jane, we'll find a glimmer of what made Jane's books so special, even today. So while Jane's formal education may have ended when she left Reading Abbey School, her social and literary training was just beginning. Cassandra was, as ever, her constant companion and friend. The two had survived a life-threatening illness together. They had gone away to school, far from home together, and now they were both at Steventon together. Jane resumed assisting her father and mother around the rectory. Sometime in Jane's early adolescence, she began helping her father with his duties as rector in the local community. The Steventon marriage register for the year 1755 to 1812 contains one very interesting record indeed. Sometime during Jane's teenage years, she scribbled on one of the marriage certificates a fake record between a fictional man named Henry Frederick Howard Fitzwilliam of London and a simple country girl named Jane Austen. Maybe Jane was full of imagination, creating romantic heroes like this gentleman in her head. Or maybe she was just a little bored. But Jane could also avail herself of her father's library, which would eventually span 500 books. The love of reading was a family affair. But what was she reading, and what impact did it have on her first literary creations? While we can't date exactly what year she was reading which novel, from her family and her writings, we can glean some clues. Here is one account from her brother Henry.
At a very early age, Jane was enamoured of Gilpin and the picturesque. Her reading was very extensive in history and belles-lettres, her memory extremely tenacious. Her favourite moral writers were Johnson in prose and Cooper in verse.
For those not well versed in 18th century literature, let's break this down a little. William Gilpin was best known for his essays on the picturesque, the definitive style of 18th century landscape painting, which tells us that young Jane enjoyed art. Belles Lettres refers to a broad category of literary writing that encompassed essays, criticism, and some forms of fiction. In the most literal sense, this means that Jane enjoyed beautiful writing. But Henry likely meant to imply that young Jane was well-read in cultural criticism of her day. Johnson refers to Samuel Johnson of dictionary fame, but he was also a well-known essayist, travel writer, and fiction writer, and Jane's copy of his novel Rasselas still survives. And William Cooper was one of the most popular poets of the day. So what Henry tells us here is that Jane was well-read. She had an elegant and refined taste in literature. She read broadly, and what she read was the best to be read. But we must remember that when Henry wrote this, Jane was dead, and her popularity was soaring. The Austens generally depicted Jane as very inoffensive after her death, eager to portray her with as much broad appeal as possible. This is not to say that Henry was wrong. We know young Jane loved history because she wrote in her brother's copy of the History of England. She even wrote her own History of England. We also know for a fact that William Cooper was her favorite poet. But for all that Jane read works like
God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm.
She also read works like
You need not upbraid me with that, mother, cries Molly. You yourself was brought to bed a sister there within a week after you was married. Yes, hussy, answered the enraged mother. So I was, and what was the mighty matter of that? I was made an honest woman then, and if you was to be made an honest woman, I should not be angry. But you must have to doing with a gentleman, you nasty slut. You will have a bastard, hussy, you will, and that I defy anyone to say of me.
That was an excerpt from Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, one of the most popular novels of the 18th century. We're not sure when Jane read it, but odds are she read it when she was still young. We know from later in life that Jane did not enjoy Fielding's work, but she did read it. Once again, we can only ballpark what Jane was reading in this period. We do know which of the authors she professed to enjoy later in life were writing at this point, but we can't pin down the exact titles she was picking up when she was 11, 12, 13 years old. But throughout her life, and almost certainly during this early period as well, Jane was reading widely. She read quite a bit of sentimental fiction, which is reflected in her early works. These novels were filled with what Jane and her contemporaries would have called sensibility. Yes, sensibility, as in sense and sensibility. When you hear the word sensibility, consider it to mean the feeling or emotionality of a book. It was expected that the sentimental novel, or the novel of sensibility, to be filled with quote-unquote great feeling. That stories should be affecting, and that such affecting scenes would have a physical effect on the body. When you read an 18th century novel filled with scenes of women fainting, or men becoming so overwhelmed with emotion that they break out into fevers, that's sensibility. There was a big cult around sensibility at this time, and some people even thought that sensibility could teach people right from wrong. And that's why so many novels of this period feature what we, as modern readers, might consider to be outrageous storylines. Abduction, seduction, duels, lost family connections. There were banditti in every forest and a foundling in every haystack. Female characters were stolen away, falsely imprisoned, tricked into fake marriages, and hounded by evil seducers. All done to make the reader feel. But sensibility was more than a cheap tool to get a rise out of readers. Here's Dr. Kim Simpson, Deputy Director of Chawton House.
Early women novelists or early women writers, people like Aphra Behn, Della Riviere Manley, the writing that they were doing, the prose fiction that they were working with, was very much a way of reflecting on the political situation of the time and reflecting on the very clear kind of political divisions. And what those women did was to translate what was happening in the political world into a kind of sexual world, into a world of seductions and falls from grace.
Although Jane was not a sentimental writer in this tradition, her works do derive from this genre, and she was actively reading and consuming many novels of this type. To understand Jane's earliest works, we need to understand the novel at this period, so we can understand the tradition that Jane inherited, as well as the tradition that she subverted. Some of these were novels that Jane could have been reading as a teenager. Others were works we know she read later in life, but provide useful examples. So let's bust some common myths about Jane Austen and the early English novel. Myth number 1. The myth of male writers. Jane Austen was not the first female novelist in the English language. In fact, she benefited from nearly 150 years of amazing female talent that preceded her in England alone. Despite the fact that men did read and write novels, both novel reading and novel writing were stereotyped in this period as women's activities or hobbies. Here's Dr. Simpson again.
A lot of the people who come and visit us here have an impression that really no women were writing before Jane Austen, or if they were writing anonymously, which is, again, thanks Virginia Woolf, who said all anonymous writers are women, which is not the case at all. So there's a kind of mistaken belief that women aren't participating in the publishing industry, in writing novels. And actually, we've got 4,500 works in our collection, many of which predate Austen. And they tell a very different story about a really vibrant literary culture that women are a huge part of. Novels in particular become the kind of feminine art form. Novels become the place where they shine. And actually, by the end of the 18th century, women were writing the majority of novels rather than men. Many of them are publishing under their own names as well. A lot of them are very canny at what we now call marketing. So they use their names to help them sell novels.
For example, we know as an adult, Jane read Belinda by Maria Edgeworth. Here's one excerpt from the novel, in which Lady Delacour prepares for a duel.
She accepted my challenge with pleasure, and should do herself the honour of meeting me at 6 o'clock the next morning. That Miss Honour O'Grady would be her friend upon the occasion, and that pistols were the weapons she preferred. When I saw my antagonist and her friend, actually pistol in hand, waiting for us, they were both in men's clothes.
She also enjoyed Frances Burney's works. Burney, of all the authors, may have been a strong literary influence on Jane. Jane even borrows the name of one of Burney's villains from her novel Evelina, which was published in 1778. Can you identify what name I'm talking about?
Our party drove off first. We were silent and unsociable, for the difficulties attending this arrangement had made everyone languid and fatigued. Unsociable, I must own, we continued, but very short was the duration of our silence, as we had not proceeded 30 yards before every voice was heard at once, for the coach broke down. I suppose we concluded, of course, that we were all half killed by the violent shrieks that seemed to come from every mouth. The chariot was stopped, the servants came to our assistance, and we were taken out of the carriage, without having been at all hurt. The night was dark and wet, but I had scarce touched the ground when I was lifted suddenly from it by Sir Clement Willoughby, who begged permission to assist me. though he did not wait to have it granted, but carried me in his arms back to Ranelagh.
That's right. In Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, the duplicitous suitor John Willoughby rescues Marianne Dashwood in a similar fashion. Novels in this period, as you might have noticed, did not shy away from danger and impropriety. The threat that a female protagonist in these novels faced was not just to her life, but also to her virtue. And that brings us to myth number 2, the myth of manners. Novels in this period were not particularly polite. Sure, some were more moralistic or euphemistic than others. What they called moral tales was a genre of novel in and of itself, and moral tales were indeed very popular. But many other novels dealt with topics of sex, violence, social ruin, and gender. Despite her status as a gentlewoman, Jane read many of these more salacious novels. She even makes reference to them in her own novels. This is an important point to understand. Despite her own politeness, Jane read unsavory novels. Perhaps not when she was very young, but by her late teens and early 20s, she was certainly familiar with some of them. Let's take The Monk by Matthew Lewis, published in 1796, a novel which Jane disparages in Northanger Abbey. It is perhaps the most shocking example of a popular novel that depicted explicit sexual violence on women. I'm not going to quote The Monk, as it contains elements of sexual assault, incest, and violence against women, but just know that I will spend a moment describing it. The Monk follows the titular monk, who wants to seduce a beautiful, innocent woman named Antonia. Despite his vows of celibacy, the monk is lovers with Matilda, who, unbeknownst to him, is a demon in disguise. Through her demonic allies, Matilda gives the monk various magic powers that allow him to sexually assault Antonia. Because Antonia is no longer pure, he no longer wants her, and he murders her as a result. The devil himself appears at the end of the novel and reveals that Antonia had been his sister all along. Let's be clear, Jane Austen hated this novel. She made this very clear in Northanger Abbey, when the villain, John Thorpe, expressed his admiration for the monk.
Catherine, humbled and ashamed, was going to apologise for her question, but he prevented her by saying, "Novels are so full of nonsense and stuff. There has not been a tolerably decent one come out since Tom Jones, except The Monk. I read that t'other day. But as for all the others, they are the stupidest things in creation."
The fact that John Thorpe only enjoys The Monk and Tom Jones tells the reader everything they need to know about him. This is an 18th century red flag. But at the end of the day, Jane did read it. Jane read about sex. She knew what it was. She understood violence. She understood consent. So why is that important? Myth number 3. The myth that Jane Austen was simply a romance writer. Don't get me wrong, it is totally valid to love Jane Austen's romantic plots. We also love Jane for her storytelling capabilities, her satire, and her wit. But that's not why Jane Austen is considered one of the greats. Jane is considered to be the mother of realism. Other authors of the period salivated over Jane's ability to create exciting plots around ordinary people. That Jane wrote about everyday things and normal people. No bandits, no mysterious revelations, no abductions, minimal seductions. And yet, they couldn't get enough of it. Don't take my word for it. Here's Sir Walter Scott's. This excerpt, originally published in his review of Emma, describes his take on Pride and Prejudice.
This is one of the portraits from ordinary life which shows our author's talents in a very strong point of view. A friend of ours, whom the author never saw or heard of, was at once recognised by his own family as the original of Mr. Bennet, and we do not know if he has yet got rid of the nickname.
In other words, Jane wrote such lifelike characters that Scott and his friends immediately recognized a Mr. Bennet in their own lives. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that about Jane Austen. Whether it's in a late 19th century piece of literary criticism or on a social media post in 2026, people feel like they know Jane Austen's characters as though they were real. But how did she get there? How did Jane Austen, reading all of these novels, good and bad, critically acclaimed and critically panned, light and moral as well as problematic and disturbing, create these spectacular works of realism, these tales that have been adapted time and time again? It starts with her teenaged writings. Because in her teenaged writings, we see the first evidence of her genius at work. We see her absorbing all of the books she is reading and playing with the structures, the ideas, the cliches. We see her satirizing for the first time, and we see her playing with the English language. And it all begins before she's even a teenager. It is no surprise that sometime in 1787 or 1788, Jane would begin the first of her known literary endeavors. This body of work, roughly written between 1787 and 1793, is referred to as her teenaged writings. Traditionally, scholars called it the juvenilia, which is a literary term for works written in childhood or adolescence. On this podcast, you'll hear scholars use both teenage writings and juvenilia interchangeably. Jane was clearly proud of these stories because the copies we have are not thought to be the originals. Scholars believe that Jane copied these 29 pieces herself from their original manuscripts into a series of 3 blank manuscript books, perhaps to share them more easily with family members or to simply keep them for her own record. These volumes were each labeled by Jane: Volume the First, Volume the Second, and Volume the Third. Together, they make up over 90,000 words of text. Volume the First contains the stories believed to have been written between 1787 and 1790. Of the 13 pieces in this volume, 2 may have been written in later years. But generally, Volume the First are considered to be Jane's earliest surviving written works, composed when she was between 12 and 15 years old. Remember, we have no letters from Jane from before the year she turned 21. So the teenage writings are an incredibly fertile ground for understanding Jane's development as a writer and as a person. Here is Dr. Misty Kruger, professor at the University of Maine at Farmington, and an expert on Jane Austen's teenaged writings.
We don't have a lot of evidence from Jane Austen's life. Everything that we think we know, we've kind of scrambled and we've found in letters that she wrote, in family anecdotes. I find her in every piece of her teenage writings because I look at everything she wrote when she was a teenager as a snapshot of who she was and who she would become. And if we do take the literature as a kind of biographical marker of who she was, then if we start with her juvenilia, we get a sense of her as an author. And as an author writing her juvenilia, I think that she just really wanted to have fun. And I've read a lot of juvenilia by a lot of different authors, including Bronte sisters, and it reads very differently. The thing about the juvenilia for Jane Austen, I always feel, is that she's always so self-aware of herself. Self-aware of herself sounds redundant, right? But she's so self-aware of being a writer. Every piece is by the author or has a dedication, right? It has some kind of inscription. She's really thinking of each piece as a single piece that stands up on its own, that has a particular recipient in mind. But then when we look across all of them, we kind of start to see these patterns. And these patterns just have to do with this teenage writer being a true rebel. So from the start, the original author, Jane Austen, the teenager, was breaking all the rules, being a rebel, creating monsters, and having a good time doing it. And it's funny because people, when they come to her juvenilia after reading her novels, they're oftentimes so shocked. They're like, no, this cannot be Jane Austen. And I'm like, yeah, it's definitely her.
The earliest of her stories is called Frederick and Elfrida. In this story, Frederick and Elfrida are cousins who are to be married. As Jane wrote,
"They were exceedingly handsome and so much alike that it was not everyone who knew them apart. Nay, even their most intimate friends had nothing to distinguish them by, but the shape of the face, the colour of the eye, the length of the nose, and the difference of the complexion.
Elfrida's friend Charlotte, meanwhile, is so accommodating and people-pleasing that she accidentally agrees to 2 proposals.
It was not till the next morning that Charlotte recollected the double engagement she had entered into. But when she did, the reflection of her past folly operated so strongly on her mind that she resolved to be guilty of a greater, and to that end threw herself into a deep stream which ran through her aunt's pleasure grounds in Portland Place. She floated to Crankham-Dunbury, where she was picked up and buried. The following epitaph, composed by Frederick, Elfrida, and Rebecca, was placed on her tomb. Here lies our friend, who having promised that unto 2 she would be married, threw her sweet body and her lovely face into the stream that runs through Portland Place.
After Charlotte's death, Elfrida wants to marry Frederick, but she has a delicate constitution. She falls into a series of fainting fits, which is evidence of her great sensibility.
The instant she had the first idea of such an attachment, she flew to Frederick and, in a manner truly heroic, spluttered out to him her intention of being married the next day. To one in his predicament who possessed less personal courage than Friedrich was master of, such a speech would have been death. But he, not being the least terrified, boldly replied, "Damn, Elfrida, you may be married tomorrow, but I won't." This answer distressed her too much for her delicate constitution. She accordingly fainted, and was in such a hurry to have a succession of fainting fits that she had scarcely patience enough to recover from one before she fell into another.
Frederick then hears how badly Elfrida is fainting and agrees to marry her. The end. It's not really a grand work of literature, but it is funny and silly in the way that a young adolescent girl would write. Another story she wrote in this period was Henry and Eliza, likely named after her brother and cousin, although neither have much in common with the titular characters. In the story, Eliza is described as virtuous, except, of course, for one itsy-bitsy little flaw.
Beloved by Lady Harcourt, adored by St. George, and admired by all the world, she lived in a continued course of uninterrupted happiness, till she had attained her 18th year, when happening one day to be detected in stealing a banknote of £50, she was turned out of doors by her inhuman benefactors.
Eliza is brought into the household of the Duchess and her daughter, Lady Harriet. Eliza then runs off with Lady Harriet's lover, Lord Cecil. This ruffles some feathers.
Her Grace, as soon as she had read the letter, which sufficiently explained the whole affair, flew into the most violent passion, and after having spent an agreeable half-hour in calling them by all the shocking names her rage could suggest to her, sent out after them 300 armed men, with orders not to return without their bodies, dead or alive, intending that if they should be brought to her in the latter condition, to have them put to death in some torture-like manner, after a few years' confinement.
Married life was difficult for Eliza.
In France they remained 3 years, during which time they became the parents of 2 boys, and at the end of it, Eliza became a widow without anything to support either her or her children. They had lived since their marriage at the rate of £18,000 a year, of which Mr. Cecil's estate being rather less than the 20th part, they had been able to save but a trifle, having lived to the utmost extent of their income.
According to the Bank of England, £18,000 in 1788 would be about $2.3 million today. You can see young Jane sharpening her wit through these early stories. She's teasing the same tropes she herself read in sentimental novels. She uses the language of virtue and applies it to a thief. She picks on popular tropes like babies found in haystacks and vengeful lovers and turns them on their head. She mocks the upper-class aesthetics of most novels. Stories like these are often characterized as burlesque. Not that type of burlesque. Burlesque in this case refers to a type of comedic style that uses heavy caricature to parody popular stories. Henry and Eliza makes fun of the foundling trope popular in this period. Eliza was found in a haystack as a baby. It was revealed, at the end of the story, that her biological mother left her in the haystack, forgot she gave birth, and then found the baby and raised her as her adoptive daughter. Frederick and Elfrida, on the other hand, plays with the strictures of amatory fiction, what you might call today a romance novel. And while they're not as refined or as polished as her novels, people still love the teenaged writings today.
I can't even remember why I first read any piece from the Juvenilia, but at some point I sat down and decided I'm going to see what these things are. I'd heard of them. Once I started doing research on Northanger Abbey, people would say things like, oh, it's kind of like her teenage writings. And then I kept going like, what are these things? And so I bought a book of her teenage writings, and I read one that I think was the one that was probably referred to a lot in what I was reading in terms of research, and it was the History of England. So I read the History of England, and then I was just like, okay, I thought she was funny when she wrote Northanger Abbey, but now I'm like dying here. Like, I'm laughing so hard that I just got to see what she's doing now as a teenage writer. And then I just got really interested in the fact that all of these things she had written, all of these pieces, she saved and she shared with her family and friends. And they were kind of precursors to this really great humorist that I was finding in Northanger Abbey. And then eventually I feel like that opened up Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility for me as a reader too, just really looking at how funny she is.
While we may not be able to say what Jane was reading in this period, through her earliest works, we can see the influence of a broad range of literature that she was consuming and subverting. This squares with what we do know she read later in life, suggesting a consistent pattern of readership from youth to adulthood. Jane's earliest writings from this period show a genius in progress. They're still immature, still girlish and inflected with childlike humor, but we see her intelligence and her growing literary aptitude. Which leads us to a curious literary incident that has some scholars baffled. We start in Oxford, not with Jane Austen, but with two of the Austen brothers, Henry and James. James, as we know, was the eldest Austen, destined for a career in the church. Henry was a middle child, sometimes called Jane's favorite. In 1788, Henry left Steventon to matriculate at St. John's College, Oxford. There he joined his brother James, and the two embarked on the literary venture, The Loiterer. The Loiterer was a magazine first released in January 1789. It had a strongly satirical bent. The first issue began,
Few, I believe, will be hardy enough to doubt the efficacy of a good name, and still fewer will deny that name to be well chosen, which pays a compliment to 4/5 of the English nation. For, if family connection can recommend us to the protection of the great, what patronage may not the loiterer hope for, who is allied to some of the richest men and prettiest women in the kingdom?
It seems as though Jane's wit may have been hereditary too. The Loiterer began with a small circulation in Oxford. It later expanded to Birmingham, London, Bath, and Reading. But it would only run for 14 months. The Loiterer playfully satirized more serious periodicals of the day, such as The Spectator or The Rambler. It offered cultural critiques under the guise of unsolicited letters, written into The Loiterer by their supposed readership. Most, but perhaps not all, of these letters were written by Henry and James, or by one of their friends. There is one article that stands out in The Loiterer. It was the first written, allegedly, by a woman, and it was signed Sophia Sentiment. The letter complained the Loiterer did not contain any sufficiently exciting stories for its female readers. There are a few strange details about this letter that stand out. For one, unlike any other letter in The Loiterer, the Sophia Sentiment letter was given special attention by the editors. James wrote an introduction to the letter, and it is one of the only, if not the only, pieces in The Loiterer that has such an introduction. Second, The The letter also warranted a rather lengthy response from James. These were also unusual for the paper. Usually, they published their so-called letters from readers without further editorializing or commentary. But there is a third detail that stands out to readers: the tone, the sarcastic, biting tone. It begins,
Sir, I write this to inform you that you are very much out of my good graces, and that if you do not mend your manners, I shall soon drop your acquaintance.
Sophia Sentiment wrote with a key complaint.
I am sorry, however, to say, but really, sir, I think it the stupidest work of the kind I ever saw. Only conceive, in 8 papers, no one sentimental story about love and honour and all that. Not one Eastern tale full of bashers and hermits, pyramids and mosques. No, not even an allegory or dream have yet made their appearance in the Loiterer.
Basically, Sophia is mad there is nothing to interest women in their newspaper. She then delivers a scathing blow.
From all which I do conclude that you are neither more nor less than some old fellow of a college who never saw anything of the world beyond the limits of the university, and never conversed with a female, except your bedmaker and laundress.
Ah, but here is the piece de resistance. Pay close attention to this part.
Let us see some nice affecting stories, relating the misfortunes of 2 lovers who died suddenly just as they were going to church. Let the lover be killed in a duel, or lost at sea, or you may make him shoot himself just as you please. And as for his mistress, she will of course go mad. Or, if you will, you may kill the lady and let the lover run mad. Only remember, whatever you do, that your hero and heroine must possess a great deal of feeling. But if not, may your work be condemned to the pastry cook's shop, and you may always continue a bachelor and be plagued with a maiden sister to keep house for you.
So why do we care about this random letter? Well, in 1966, literary scholar Zachary Cope made the bold assertion that Sophia Sentiment was actually a young Jane Austen. If true, this would be Jane's first time in print, at the young age of 13. And it would tell us a lot about the young mind forming at this critical period in her life. But when it comes to this startling claim, scholars are divided. Many think it was just as likely that James or Henry wrote the letter. After all, it was their newspaper, and they were strong writers themselves. Could this sharp, mocking letter really be the work of a 13-year-old girl? So, what do we do in murky situations like this? We look at the evidence. That's right, it's time for another Austen history mystery. Case number 2. Is Jane Austen Sophia Sentiment? I wish there was a suggestive letter or a piece of documentation that supported this mystery, but it's largely conjecture. There's no family lore, letters, or other documentary evidence that suggests that Jane and Sophia are the same person. Just stylistic similarities between this work and Jane's, along with a distinction in form between this letter and other letters in the Loiterer. The timeline does match up, however. Jane Austen was 13 years old when this letter was published in the Loiterer. That's smack dab in the period when she was writing her teenaged works. At this point, she has likely already written Frederick and Elfrida, Henry and Eliza, and a handful of other stories. That same year, she was writing stories like The Beautiful Cassandra and Amelia Webster. So let's use these stories as a basis to examine the Sophia Sentiment letter to see if there's any similarities that could shed light on its authorship. Exhibit A. The similarities. The inimitable Austenian scholar Deirdre Lefay once noted that Jane owned a book called Poems and Plays by William Haley, published in 1785, notably also in this same period. One of those plays was called The Mausoleum, and it featured a character named Sophia Sentiment. Some scholars have also pointed to similarities between the Sophia Sentiment letter and Jane Austen's teenage writings. For example, the phrases run mad and great deal of feeling are prevalent in both the Sophia letter and Jane's early writing. There is also the peculiar usage of the word nice in the Sophia Sentiment letter. Sophia Sentiment's usage of the word is interesting for this time period. In the early 18th century, nice meant accurate in judgment to minute exactness, or delicate and refined. But in the mid 18th century, it began to adopt what we would recognize as its modern meaning, agreeable or delightful. By the 1790s, it was largely being used to describe people and their behavior, in the same way that we would use the word today. The way that Sophia Sentiment uses nice to describe a book is almost slang. It's a very contemporary usage for the time period, and not really what would have been considered standard English. And it is very similar to the way that Catherine Morland uses it in one of Jane's earliest written novels, Northanger Abbey, when she says, "Do you not think Udolpho the nicest book in the world?" In the book, Henry Tilney mocks her use of the word nice, responding, "The nicest, by which I suppose you mean the neatest. That must depend on the binding." This may not seem really significant, except that Jane also uses the word frequently in her early letters. The joke in Northanger Abbey shows that she knows it's not really standard usage. It's very colloquial, but she uses it anyways. It even appears in her earliest surviving letter, in which she refers to the nice long letter sent by Cassandra. Through the 1790s, she uses it to describe a butter churn, a cap, a party, a chest of drawers, and 2 very nice-sized rooms. Interesting coincidences to be sure, but not necessarily a smoking gun. Exhibit B, the themes. We do have a body of literature against which we can judge the Sophia Sentiment letter. Now, we've spent the whole of this episode talking about 18th century literary tropes, and I asked you to pay attention to that last paragraph of the letter, and it's all for this. In that paragraph, Sophia Sentiment mocks a tension found in a certain class of 18th century novels, especially novels associated with women's reading habits of this period. As we learned earlier, these novels are about virtuous women and provide nice, affecting stories about love and honor, as Sophia herself puts it. But underneath that, many of these stories were fundamentally violent. Bandit attacks, murders, carriage accidents, false imprisonments, and sudden deaths were common motifs in the more salacious novels, and not necessarily out of place, even in what we might think of the more highbrow novels. These are elements we find in Jane's early writing from that same period. Recall Henry and Eliza, where Eliza is a thief who steals another woman's man. In response, the Duchess sent an army after her. There is also the story, The Beautiful Cassandra, believed to be written the same year as Sophia Sentiment's letter. In chapter 4, Cassandra
proceeded to a pastry cook's where she devoured 6 ices, refused to pay for them, knocked down the pastry cook, and walked away.
Here's Dr. Kruger.
For people who haven't read Austen's teenage writings, I will tell you that she's got murderers in there. She has people who look freakish, which is a monstrous term. And she did that intentionally in the very first piece in the 3 volumes. She has characters who are constantly breaking the law by stealing, and petty crimes, forgeries. But murder is always at the top of the list for me when I think about, like, what are these human monsters? So she has a few characters who just are bad.
So when we see Sophia Sentiment writing about nice, affecting stories where everyone ends up dead or tortured, we can compare it to a similar interest that pops up in Jane's writing of this era.
I agree with scholars who suggest that Sophia Sentiment might have been, we'll say, the pseudonym for Little Jane Austen. And it's a really, really fun piece that connects, in my opinion, directly to her juvenilia. Sophia Sentiment says things in this one article in the magazine that if you look at what she says and you go back to the juvenilia, you can find echoes. So for me, it's a piece called Love and Friendship from her juvenilia that is an echo of what's in The Loiterer. So it's kind of fun to think about, like, could Jane Austen have been Sophia's sentiment? If yes, then this would be her first published piece of work that, again, would have been a teenager, but we don't know. We ultimately don't know.
But there's another element of the letter that has people debating. This letter seems to be mocking women readers. Would a young Jane really make that argument? Exhibit C, the thesis. Jane would prove to be, over the course of her life, a proud proponent of the novel. Her novel, Northanger Abbey, included a famous defense of the novel, in which Jane asserted that in novels, quote, "the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humor are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language." And Northanger Abbey was, of her printed novels, one of the first written. She would start writing the first versions of it just a few years after the Sophia Sentiment letter was printed. So if Sophia's sentiment is her, why is she seemingly mocking women and the books they enjoy? Claire Tomlin, in her famous biography of Jane Austen, found it unlikely that Jane would write so condescendingly about women readers when she had proven in so many other cases to be their defender. The central question here is, who is Sophia's sentiment mocking? Is it women readers? Or is it boring Oxford men who think they're better than everyone else? Or is Sophia's sentiment a character, like the other violent, naughty women of Jane's earliest works? A burlesque caricature of an archetype she read about in books and magazines? There is another possibility. Henry and James composed many of the letters in their periodical, and it could have easily been one of them. Or it could have just been a random correspondent. Conclusion. At the end of the day, there's just no way to tell. We will never know if Jane was Sophia's sentiment. But the idea is tantalizing, and I will say that the possibility definitely seems to be there. Do I think that Jane Austen is Sophia's sentiment? I don't know. Do I want Jane Austen to be Sophia's sentiment? 100%, absolutely yes. When we talk about finding Jane Austen, this mystery is a core example of how we do that. The wit, the genius, the burn unit level snark in this letter are so compelling and so much what I want Jane to be. Sarcastic and witty and just a little edgy. I want 13-year-old Jane to be holding her own with her Oxford-educated brothers. I want Jane to be shooting out her opinions into the world, to be mocking the literary establishment and prescribed gender roles. I want this story to be part of Jane's origin story. What do you think? Shoot us an email or leave us a voicemail. We may just feature your response in a future episode. Tell us if you think Jane Austen is Sophia's sentiment. Well, I sit here and text my brother real quick. You have never conversed with a female except your bedmaker and laundress. Next time on Finding Jane Austen, Jane grows up. Music, theater, and books continue to influence her world as her writing becomes more mature, and so does she. Thanks for listening to Finding Jane Austen. If you liked today's episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It helps us spread the love of Austen. Finding Jane Austen is a joint production of Revolutionary Histories and Primary Source Media. The series is researched and written by me, Dr. Ann Fertig. My executive producers are Jeanette Patrick and Jim Ambusky. Our thanks to our scholars Kim Simpson and Misty Kruger for their contributions to this episode. And to our voice actors, Emily Brady, Grace Mallon, Adam Smith, and Craig Gallagher. Subscribe to Finding Jane Austen on your favorite podcast app. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.